What happens when an undercover CEO walks into his own restaurant and finds a disaster unfolding? That's exactly what David Calloway faced when he secretly visited one of his locations, only to witness rude employees, poor leadership, and frustrated customers. But instead of walking away, he took action, exposing the problems and turning the failing restaurant around. This is a story of accountability, leadership, and transformation that proves one decision can change everything. Stay tuned, because this undercover mission reveals shocking truths and a powerful lesson in business and leadership. David Calloway sat in his car outside DineRight Bistro, Branch 8, a popular location of his growing restaurant chain. From the outside, everything looked normal. Customers entering with eager anticipation, waitstaff moving between tables, and the warm glow of ambient lighting casting a welcoming feel. But David knew appearances could be deceiving. Over the past few months, he had been receiving disturbing reports about declining service, frustrated employees, and an increase in customer complaints. Despite reassurances from his management team that everything was under control, online reviews and anonymous employee feedback painted a different picture, one of poor morale, rude service, and an unmotivated workforce. At 50 years old, David had built DineRight Bistro from the ground up, starting with a small cafe before expanding it into a chain of over 25 locations across the region. He prided himself on customer experience and a positive work culture, but as his company grew, he found himself spending more time in boardrooms than in the restaurants. Now, faced with a growing problem, he realized he needed to step in personally. Reports from Branch 8 suggested a serious leadership failure, and David refused to let his company slip into mediocrity. Tonight, he was going undercover as a regular diner to experience reality firsthand. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, he wanted to blend in. No one would recognize him as the owner. He wasn't here for a formal inspection or a staged staff meeting where everyone would be on their best behavior. He was here to see the unfiltered truth. As he stepped out of his car and walked toward the entrance, he took a deep breath. Would he find a team of hard-working employees just struggling under pressure? Or was there truly a toxic culture brewing inside? He was about to find out. With a casual stride, he pushed open the glass doors and entered the restaurant, the aroma of sizzling food and the hum of conversation filling the air. But as he scanned the room, it didn't take long for the first red flag to appear. As soon as David stepped inside DineRight Bistro, Branch 8, he could sense that something was off. The restaurant was busy, but the energy felt tense rather than lively. Guests sat at tables, some scanning the room impatiently while others were craning their necks, trying to catch a waiter's attention. The staff bustled between tables, but rather than a smooth, synchronized operation, it felt disorganized and chaotic. A few waiters rushed from table to table, while others moved sluggishly or lingered near the counter. It didn't take long for David to spot the contrast in work ethic among the employees. Near the back, a young waiter with neatly combed hair and a name tag that read Jake was patiently assisting an elderly couple. He leaned in attentively as they asked about the menu, taking the time to explain their options, even suggesting a lighter dish when the woman mentioned her dietary restrictions. Despite the clear pressure of a full house, Jake kept his composure, never appearing rushed or irritated. Then, David's eyes drifted toward the opposite end of the restaurant, where a tall, slouching waiter leaned against the counter, phone in hand, scrolling absently. His name tag read Ryan. Unlike Jake, he seemed completely disengaged. Several customers were trying to get his attention, but he barely acknowledged them. A woman from a nearby table waved him down, asking for a refill, and without even looking up, he muttered, "Yeah, in a sec," before going back to his phone. David's stomach tightened. This was exactly what he had been hearing complaints about: staff members who lacked professionalism, ignored guests, and did the bare minimum. The worst part? No one seemed to be correcting it. The other employees simply avoided eye contact with Ryan, as if they had long since given up on expecting him to help. As David casually moved toward an open table, a family at a booth near the entrance tried to flag Ryan down, asking for a menu recommendation. Ryan let out an exaggerated sigh, shrugged, and said, "It's all the same, just pick something." The father gave him a baffled look, clearly annoyed, but Ryan was already walking away, shaking his head. David exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a chaotic restaurant. It was an environment where bad behavior was being tolerated. David settled into his chair, casually picking up the menu while keeping a discreet eye on the restaurant floor. He had already noticed the stark difference between the hardworking Jake and the disengaged Ryan, but now it was time to experience the service firsthand. He flagged down Ryan, who was still leaning against the counter, tapping on his phone. Ryan glanced up lazily, his expression bored and uninterested. Instead of approaching the table immediately, he took his time, finishing whatever he was doing on his phone before finally sauntering over. "Yeah?" he said, not even bothering with a proper greeting. David maintained a neutral expression. "I'm trying to decide between the grilled salmon and the ribeye. What would you recommend?" Ryan barely looked at the menu. "I don't know, man. It's all the same. Just depends if you want fish or meat." His tone was flat, dismissive, and utterly unhelpful. David raised an eyebrow. "All right, what about allergies? Do you have gluten-free options?" Ryan sighed loudly as if David had just asked him to recite a Shakespearean monologue. "It's on the menu, dude. Just read it." David nodded, pressing his lips together to contain his frustration. This was exactly the type of service that drove customers away. No enthusiasm, no effort, just bare minimum answers, wrapped in irritation. Meanwhile, across the room, Jake was handling a completely different situation with Grace. An elderly couple had just flagged him down, confused about the menu. Instead of brushing them off, Jake knelt slightly to their level, carefully explaining the options and even offering suggestions based on their preferences. When the woman expressed concern about sodium levels, he didn't dismiss her, he assured her that he'd check with the chef. The contrast was staggering. While Jake put in the effort to make guests feel valued, Ryan treated every customer like an inconvenience. David decided to test one last thing. He waved Ryan over again. "What are the house specials tonight?" Ryan exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "They're on the board, near the entrance." David remained calm, but internally his irritation was growing. Ryan wasn't just lazy, he was actively making the customer experience worse. As Ryan walked away without another word, David knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a bad employee problem. It was a culture problem. As David continued observing, a scene near the front counter caught his attention. A middle-aged woman stood with her arms crossed, frustration etched on her face as she held up a plate of half-eaten food. "Excuse me, I just got this dish and it's completely cold," she said firmly. "I'd like it replaced or at least reheated." Ryan, still exuding his usual indifference, strolled over to the counter, barely glancing at the woman's plate. "Yeah, that's just how it's served," he said with a shrug. The woman blinked in disbelief. "Are you seriously telling me that a cold steak is intentional?" Ryan sighed dramatically, crossing his arms. "Look, lady, I don't make the food. Maybe next time ask for it hot?" A few heads turned at his tone. David felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't just bad service, this was outright disrespect. Before the woman could escalate further, the restaurant manager, Mike, finally emerged from the back. David watched closely, hoping to see some accountability. Instead, Mike barely looked concerned. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," he said, his voice overly polite but empty of sincerity. The woman quickly explained what had happened, her frustration mounting. "And then your waiter basically told me it's my fault for expecting hot food," she added, pointing toward Ryan, who stood a few feet away, completely unbothered. Mike let out a forced chuckle. "Oh, don't mind Ryan. That's just how he is." David nearly dropped his fork. "That's just how he is?" What was the manager's response? Instead of holding his employee accountable, Mike brushed off Ryan's behavior like an annoying quirk. David clenched his fists under the table. This was why the restaurant was in trouble. It wasn't just about one bad employee, the problem ran deeper. If management refused to address toxic behavior, then the entire team would suffer. To make matters worse, instead of handling the situation himself, Mike turned to Jake. "Hey Jake, can you fix this for her?" he said casually, as if it were no big deal. Jake hesitated but quickly nodded, taking the plate and apologizing to the woman, even though he wasn't the one at fault. David exhaled slowly. This wasn't a leadership issue. It was a complete lack of leadership. If the manager wouldn't enforce basic standards, then how many other employees felt the same frustration as Jake? One thing was clear. This wasn't a case of a single bad apple. The rot had spread to the core. David had already seen enough to confirm that something was deeply wrong in this restaurant, but what happened next solidified his decision to step in. Near the center of the dining area, a young couple with a toddler and a 5-year-old flagged down Ryan, hoping to get some extra napkins and utensils. The mother smiled politely. "Excuse me, could we get some more napkins and an extra fork for my son?" Ryan didn't even bother looking at her. With an exaggerated sigh, he grabbed a few napkins from the server station and tossed them onto the table carelessly. "There, happy?" he muttered, before turning away. The couple exchanged stunned glances, but before they could react, a man sitting at a nearby table, an older gentleman, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Hey," he called, his tone firm but calm. "That's not how you talk to customers." Ryan froze mid-step, then turned around, his face twisting in irritation. "Oh yeah?" he shot back. "And who are you, the napkin police?" A sarcastic chuckle escaped his lips, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. The older man raised an eyebrow. "I'm a paying customer, and so is that family. Maybe you should show a little respect." Ryan rolled his eyes, then let out a mocking laugh. "Right, because I'm supposed to bend over backward for a $2 tip? Get real." A few customers gasped. David felt his blood boil. The sheer disrespect, the arrogance, the entitlement was beyond anything he had expected. Not only was Ryan treating customers like a nuisance, but now he was publicly mocking them. Jake, who had been serving a nearby table, paused mid-taste, his face filled with discomfort. He looked like he wanted to step in, but it wasn't his place to correct another server, especially when the manager had already proven that discipline wasn't a priority. At that moment, David made his decision. Enough was enough. He placed his napkin on the table, took a deep breath, and stood up. Ryan still had a smug expression, completely unaware that he was about to face the consequences of his actions. David glanced around the restaurant. Customers were now watching, employees frozen, sensing a confrontation brewing. It was time to put an end to this. With steady steps, David walked toward the center of the room. The undercover boss was about to reveal himself. David strode toward the center of the restaurant, his calm yet firm presence commanding attention. The air felt thick with tension, every customer and employee sensing that something was about to happen. Ryan, still standing near the young family's table, looked mildly amused, as if expecting another lecture from an annoyed customer. But David wasn't just another diner. He was the owner, and this had gone on long enough. Clearing his throat, David spoke, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" The chatter of the restaurant faded into silence, as employees and customers alike turned to look at him. Even the manager, Mike, emerged from the back, his face puzzled as he tried to understand what was happening. David took a deep breath, then pulled out his wallet and retrieved a business card. With a flick of his wrist, he placed it on the nearest table, letting the words catch the light. David Calloway, founder and CEO, DineRight Bistro. A visible shockwave rippled through the staff. Jake's eyes widened, the color draining from Mike's face, and Ryan, well, for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely nervous. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. David turned his gaze directly to Ryan. "I've been sitting in this restaurant for over an hour," he said, his voice level but firm, "and in that time I've seen you mock customers, dismiss their requests, and disrespect the very people who keep this business running." He let the weight of his words settle before adding, "Tell me, Ryan, do you think that's acceptable?" Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced toward Mike for support, but the manager looked just as lost, his face turning a deeper shade of red. David continued, shifting his gaze toward Mike. "And you," he said, his voice edged with disappointment, "you had multiple chances to correct this behavior. Instead, you enabled it. You laughed it off. That's just how he is, right?" He shook his head. "That's not leadership. That's negligence." Mike swallowed hard, his lips pressing together, but he had no defense. David let a beat of silence linger before delivering his verdict. "Ryan, you're done here. Effective immediately." A stunned silence fell over the room. Ryan's face was drained of color. "Wait, you're firing me? Just like that?" David's expression remained unwavering. "No, Ryan, you fired yourself." As Ryan stood frozen in shock, David remained unwavering. He turned his attention toward manager Mike, whose face was still flushed, beads of sweat forming at his temple. "And as for you, Mike," David continued, his voice measured but firm, "you're not off the hook either." The manager stiffened, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. David took a step closer. Leadership isn't about ignoring problems or brushing them under the rug. It's about setting a standard and holding your team accountable. What I've seen tonight tells me that either you've failed to do that or you simply don't care. Either way, it's unacceptable. Mike opened his mouth, fumbling for words. I just didn't want to cause a scene," he finally muttered. David narrowed his eyes. "You didn't want to cause a scene?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "What you allowed to happen tonight was a disaster. Your failure to act let a toxic culture fester, hurting both your team and our customers." The room was silent. Staff members exchanged nervous glances. Customers whispered among themselves. They weren't just witnessing an employee termination. They were watching a company being held accountable in real time. David took a deep breath, allowing his tone to soften just slightly. "Mike, I'm giving you a second chance, but it comes with conditions. You're on probation, and starting tomorrow you will undergo mandatory leadership training. You'll be working directly with our senior management team to learn how to properly lead a team and uphold the standards this company was built on." Mike nodded slowly, relief washing over him, but the weight of the moment was still heavy. He knew this was his last chance. David then turned to Jake, the only employee who had consistently shown professionalism throughout the night. "And Jake," he said, his tone shifting to one of appreciation, "you've carried this team tonight. I saw how you handled frustrated customers, how you stepped in when others refused to do their jobs. That's the kind of service and attitude this company values." Jake blinked, taken aback. "I was just doing my job, sir." David nodded. "And that's exactly why I'm promoting you to head waiter, effective immediately. You'll get a raise, and I want you to help set the tone for this team moving forward." A few employees smiled, some even nodding in quiet approval. David exhaled. The cleanup had begun, but the real work was just getting started. 1 month later, David returned to DineRight Bistro, branch, ate, this time without a disguise. Unlike his last visit, he wasn't there to investigate, he was there to see if his changes had made a difference. As he walked through the entrance, he immediately noticed the shift in energy. The once tense, chaotic atmosphere had been replaced with a smoother, more welcoming flow. Customers weren't waiting impatiently or looking around for help. They were engaged in conversation, enjoying their meals, and being attended to without frustration. He scanned the room, looking for the biggest sign of change: the staff. Instead of slouching near the counter, scrolling on a phone, the waiters were attentive, moving efficiently between tables. They weren't just taking orders and delivering food, they were actually interacting with customers, smiling and making recommendations. The transformation was clear. Then he spotted Jake, now wearing a name tag that read head waiter. The young employee stood near the host station, coaching a new hire on proper service etiquette. His posture was more confident, his demeanor more assured. He was no longer just another server. He was a leader. "Jake!" David called out as he approached. Jake turned, recognition flashing across his face before he grinned. "Mr. Calloway, it's good to see you." David shook his hand. "The place looks different. How's the team holding up?" Jake exhaled, nodding. "Honestly, better than ever. At first, some of the team struggled with the changes, but once they saw that leadership actually cared, things started to shift. Customers have noticed too. We've gotten way more positive reviews this past month." David smiled. That was exactly what he wanted to hear. He had made a promise to fix what was broken, and now he could see the results firsthand. At the back of the restaurant, he noticed manager Mike, now more engaged, stepping in to help servers, checking in with customers, and ensuring things ran smoothly. It was a stark difference from the passive leader he had met a month ago. David felt a deep sense of pride, not just for the changes he had implemented, but for the people who had embraced them. It wasn't just about firing bad employees or enforcing rules. It was about creating a culture where people wanted to do better. As he stepped outside, he knew the work wasn't over. But today, DineRight Bistro had taken a step in the right direction. As David walked away from DineRight Bistro Branch 8, he took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired over the past month. What had started as a simple undercover visit to investigate complaints had turned into a wake-up call, not just for the employees, but for him as well. It was easy to get caught up in spreadsheets, reports, and boardroom discussions. But this experience had reminded him of something critical. A company's success isn't just about profits or expansion. It's about people. He had witnessed firsthand what happens when leadership neglects its employees, allowing toxicity to spread unchecked. One bad employee like Ryan could create a ripple effect of negativity, but even worse was a manager like Mike, who let it continue. Apathy from the top would always trickle down. Without accountability, respect, and proper leadership, no amount of business strategy could save a failing workplace culture. But just as toxicity could spread, so could positive change. Removing one toxic influence had created space for better leadership to grow. Mike had stepped up, Jake had flourished, and the entire restaurant had shifted from a place of frustration to one of teamwork and customer care. And the best part? Customers noticed. Reviews improved, employee morale lifted, and profits had even started trending upward. David knew this was only one step in an ongoing journey. There would always be challenges, difficult employees, and leadership gaps, but now he had a renewed commitment to staying connected, to personally visiting his restaurants, engaging with employees, and making sure leadership was held accountable. As he got into his car, he took one last look at the restaurant. The warm glow of the lights reflecting in the glass windows. DineRight Bistro was back on track, but more importantly, so was its culture. And as long as he was in charge, he would make sure it stayed that way. As David drove away from DineRight Bistro Branch 8, he felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of renewal. This experience had reaffirmed something he had always believed. A business is only as strong as the people who run it. Leadership wasn't just about sitting in a corporate office making high-level decisions. It was about staying connected, understanding the struggles on the ground, and making sure employees felt supported. The transformation of Branch 8 was just the beginning. The lessons learned here would shape future policies and leadership training across all of DineRight's locations. From now on, there would be regular unannounced visits, open communication channels for employees, and leadership programs designed to prevent the kind of toxic environment he had witnessed. The days of ignoring employee concerns were over. For Jake and the rest of the hardworking team, this wasn't just about getting rid of a bad employee. It was about creating a workplace they could be proud of. Seeing Jake step into his new role as head waiter, guiding new hires, and setting an example was proof that change was possible. It only took one person willing to step up to inspire a shift in culture. As he glanced at his phone, he saw a new email notification from corporate headquarters, a request for a meeting about expanding these changes company-widely. He smiled. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was a new beginning. DineRight Bistro was no longer just a growing restaurant chain, it was becoming something more, a place where both customers and employees could feel valued. And to David, that was the greatest success of all. The story of DineRight Bistro Branch 8 teaches a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and workplace culture. A single bad employee can damage customer experiences, but the real problem lies in leadership that allows toxic behavior to persist. In this case, Ryan's rudeness and laziness weren't just personal flaws, they were symptoms of a bigger issue: poor management. When leadership turns a blind eye, bad habits spread, morale drops, and both employees and customers suffer. However, the story also highlights that change is possible. By stepping in, David didn't just fire a problematic employee, he addressed the root cause, holding the manager accountable and promoting the right people. Jake's promotion symbolized an important shift. When good work is recognized, it inspires others to do better. The restaurant's transformation showed that culture isn't fixed, it's shaped by leadership. Ultimately, the biggest lesson is that true leadership requires staying connected. No business can thrive if the people running it are disconnected from daily operations. By engaging with employees, enforcing standards, and valuing the right people, a toxic workplace can be rebuilt into something great, one step at a time.